So we're going to continue on with some network analysis and group research. Network analysis researchers use the basic concept about groups and social networks that we have discussed to investigate how group life shapes individual behavior. Network analysis researchers are looking at concepts like embeddedness and the differences between dyads and triads and their results in group conformity. If we can understand how the groups are made up, and we can understand how the decisions within the group as a whole, and then the group as it's made up of these smaller groups of dyads and triads, then we can control the group over time. We can sway the group's public opinion. We can understand why the group is acting the way that it's acting. It's important to understand organizations, of course. An organization is any social network that is defined by a common purpose and has a boundary between its membership and the rest of the social world. Formal organizations have a set of governing structures and rules for their internal setup, while informal organizations do not. When we think about organizations, we have to think about organizational culture, and that it refers to the shared beliefs and behaviors within a social group. And then, of course, the organizational structure, which refers to the ways in which power and authority are distributed within an organization. The reason we ever even got here is because as societies became more complex, it was no longer simple to understand what was going on in society and how power was being wielded. How did we, on a regular basis, continue to socially produce the reality that is today, tomorrow, and then the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and into the future? What were the structures that were necessary? What type of organizations were necessary? What type of institutions were necessary? What were the rules of the game? How do the rules of the game impact the institutions and the organizations and the individuals within the social sphere? And if we can understand that, maybe, just maybe, we can then begin to predict what's going to happen in society. That's really what sociologists are up to. It's trying to look at the form of society and understand how that structure impacts the individual or the agency. Another important concept is institutional isomorphism, which refers to the constraining process that forces one organization to resemble other organizations that face the same set of environmental conditions. Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell came up with this idea, and they're part of the New Institutionalists, which try to develop a sociological view of institutions. They coined the phrase institutional isomorphism to get us closer to understanding what institutions were. For example, if you wanted to create a new college, you might decide that in your institution, you don't want to give student grades. Instead, you want them to learn for the sheer joy of obtaining knowledge. Unfortunately, though, if your students want to transfer to another college or continue on to graduate school, they're going to need transcripts with grades. So, because the environment is already firmly established outside of your organization, you'll have to conform if you want students to keep coming to your college to learn. So ultimately, even though you don't want to give out grades, you're going to end up giving out grades because the institutional norms require it. Another thing we need to think about is the wealth of networks. The internet has facilitated an open source or peer-based production model which promotes access to the end products and source materials. Things like Wikipedia and Linux are two examples of open source platforms. One of the key ways that material culture can change is through technology, and the internet is proving to be a major change agent. Advances like the internet have helped to disseminate information and create social movements. This is one of the reasons why net neutrality is so important right now, and you should be very up to snuff on what net neutrality is. I will post a link to some ideas on net neutrality and why it's important, and I encourage you to take a look at what's going on with the passage of the Net Neutrality Act, or actually the repealing of the Net Neutrality Act. That was just recently done by the FCC. And the last thing that we are going to talk about is the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. This is known as the Immigration and Nationality Act Amendments of 1965, otherwise known as the Hart-Celler Act. And this changed the face of immigration as we know it today, eliminating quotas on national origin and replacing this approach with a system of family preferences. Immigrants in this respect could sponsor their family members, so immigration suddenly became a network phenomenon. The reason I paused there, folks, is I was going through this slide and I'm like, what exactly does this have to do with networks? But one of the important aspects of immigration in the United States is actually in reference to networks themselves. The enclave model has been incorporated by people immigrating to the United States for a long time. Take, for example, Chinatown. If an individual usually starts out as a male, immigrates to the United States, they go to the enclave, which is a already established network of Chinese operating in San Francisco, for example, or New York City, and they plug in there, and they use the social and economic capital that is embedded in the enclave, the network, to allow themselves to have an easier transition from China to the United States. You find yourself surrounded by people that talk your language. They can connect you to work. They can begin to help you assimilate into the United States. And then they can also help you move other family members to the United States, if that's what you choose to do.